Good morning to everyone at Yarra Valley Vineyard and everyone who might be joining us from other parts of Melbourne or other parts of Australia, or I suppose other parts of the world through the magic of the interwebs. My name's Adam. I'm just a person who loves the scriptures, loves the Bible, and occasionally I'm called upon to teach at YVV. That's what I'm going to do this morning. I want to look at a passage that we all know, the first two chapters of Genesis, the first two chapters that we come to in the Bible. First two chapters of Genesis, Genesis 1 and the first part of chapter 2. Now, what I don't want to do is to engage in the debate that often rages around these chapters of Scripture, this account of creation. I don't want to engage in the debate between, on the one hand, very committed creationists, what we might call young earth creationists or six-day creationists, and equally committed evolutionary scientists on the other hand. I don't want to engage in that because I find that those two sides are actually both preoccupied with the same thing. They're preoccupied with physics, biology, geology, cosmic history. They're preoccupied with those things which are actually very modern and very Western concerns. The idea of where matter comes from is actually a very modern and Western concern. It's not an ancient Near Eastern concern. And of course, the biblical text of Genesis 1 and 2 is an ancient Near Eastern document. So we need to look at it that way. Now, I should say, there's a lot of scholarship that has been done on ancient Near Eastern thought and ancient Near Eastern culture. I'm going to touch on some of that today. Obviously, I can't touch on all of it or lots and lots of it, given the time that we have. But I'd encourage you, if you're interested in some of these ideas, you want to find out more about them, then you might want to find yourself a few books or resources. One good one is this book by John Walton. John Walton is a scholar out of Wheaton College in the United States. He wrote this book, Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. It's very, very readable, and it links in the world of ancient Near Eastern culture with the text that we find in the Old Testament and gives you a lot of insight about what you read. Now, scholars of ancient Near Eastern thought will tell us that when we read this creation account, we've actually possibly missed probably the key moment, or a key moment at least, in the text. And I want to talk about that this morning. What's the key moment that we might be missing? Well, it comes from chapter 2, and I'm going to start really at the end of the account, and then I'm going to kind of work backwards. So if you'll join me in chapter 2. Now, I don't have time this morning to read the entire account of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, or to read through it. If you're interested in it, obviously I'd encourage you to read through it yourself. You might even want to stop the video now to give yourself a chance to read through it, and then continue on with what we're going to talk about. Or you might want to wait until the video is over and then read through it yourself. It's up to you, but I'm going to continue. I'm going to start in chapter 2. Chapter 2 and the first few verses. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. What's the part that we often miss, or what's the part we often ignore? God rests. Seems like a simple thing. You might be asking, well, how is that important? And that's our problem. We often bypass this part of the account. We see it as almost something that's been tacked on to the end of it. After God finishes creation, oh, isn't that nice? He rests. But actually, the entire account leads up to this moment. It actually culminates in this moment. It's a critical moment in the account. Our confusion is really in the way that we think about rest and the word rest. Is this God taking some personal time? You know, the work of creation was mildly strenuous, and now God is kicking back, binging on some Netflix, catching up on Stranger Things, a few episodes that were missed. Is that what's going on here? No, not at all. Because that's not the ancient Israelite or the ancient Near Eastern idea of what rest actually is, or how they would have thought of God resting. The idea of God resting, scholars will tell us, the idea of God resting is actually, in a sense, royal imagery. Royal imagery, like the imagery that we'd associate with a king or a ruler. God rests when he sits on the throne, in this case, the cosmic throne, after establishing order in the cosmos, and that's important, we're going to talk about that. After establishing order in the cosmos, now God is enthroned, he is resting on the throne of creation. God is in command, in control, maintaining the order that has been established. That's what the text means when it says that God rested on the seventh day. Think about it. Everything leading up to this moment, everything in this creation account is about God establishing his order in the world. This is actually not a text of biology or astronomy or physics. It's not about those things, because those are not concerns of an ancient Near Eastern writer or the ancient Israelite writer who wrote down this text. This text is about God establishing order in the universe, order in the cosmos. And the scholars will tell us that order in the world and order in society, things functioning as they're supposed to, things having roles and jobs to do, that was a very, very high and important value in that culture. In fact, it was almost, the idea of order was almost the highest value in Near Eastern culture and society. And God was looked upon to establish and maintain that order. That was what God was expected to do. In Genesis chapter 1, when we go back to the beginning of the account, Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1 and 2, we see that the earth, it says the world, is a formless void. A formless void. It's chaos. It's really just a massive expanse of water with no order whatsoever. But God is there. God is a spirit moving over the surface of the waters. And out of this chaos, out of this lack of order, God begins to establish order. And how does he do it? Well, he separates things and gives them names. For instance, he separates light from darkness. He separates night from day, and he names them night and day, and he establishes the cycle of nights and days. He separates land from sea, and he names them land and sea. Then he gives roles and functions to the different aspects of creation. He gives them jobs to do. For instance, you might remember he talks about the lights in the heavens, and he gives them the job of establishing the cycles of night and day, and establishing the cycles of years, and establishing the times and seasons. He gives a role to the earth. He says, let it produce plants and let it produce animals. Everything has a job. Everything has a role in creation that God assigns. And of course, he also establishes categories of things, categories of plants, categories of animals, things like that. And importantly, God does all of this ordering, all of this organization. He does this all by issuing what we might call royal decrees or commands. Just like a king or just like a ruler, he issues commands like, let there be light, or let the land produce living creatures. These are types of royal decrees that God is issuing. And each time God establishes this new aspect or area of order and organization, he calls it good. And then when we get to the end of this account, the bit that we started looking at the beginning of this talk, God rests on the seventh day. After establishing order in the world, after establishing order in the cosmos, God takes final authority, sitting on the throne of the cosmos to maintain the order that has been established. Now, does this mean that God is taking a hands-off approach, letting the wheels just kind of spin? No, it doesn't mean that. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story, and it might link into what I want to talk about when it comes to the idea of God resting. A few years ago, Renee, that's my wife, you might see her walking around in the background here somewhere. Renee bought me a brand new Nord keyboard. Now, a Nord, if you're a musician, you probably know what a Nord is. If you're not, a Nord is a very high-end synthesizer, a very high-end musical keyboard. And when I got it, I was super excited, of course. And I spent days, the first few days, really organizing it, organizing the different sounds, programming it, arranging those sounds the way that I wanted them, putting them in the order that I wanted them, giving them names, arranging them just the way, in a way that was easy for me to find and easy for me to locate, that made sense to me. Playing with all the knobs and the dials and things, and adjusting the settings that adjusting the settings for the sounds that I wanted to get it just the way I liked it. And then when that was all said and done, I didn't sit down and look at it and just admire it, although it was something to be admired. I didn't do that. No, I sat down and played it. Of course, I played it. That's what the instrument is for. That's what is meant to happen. And it's meant to be there for me to play, not for me to sit back and take my hands off of it. Now, that analogy is not perfect, but it might give us some idea of what it means for God to be at rest in this text. God's rest and authority and command is, I guess, similar to that. The idea of God just sort of taking his hands off and letting the wheels spin, that idea that God is distant and far away, that occasionally, though, he shows up to do a few miracles before disappearing again, that's a thoroughly modern and a thoroughly Western idea. And it might be wise for us to abandon the notion that our modern Western ideas about the world and about God are somehow naturally superior to ancient ones. They are very different than ancient ones. Ancient Israelite understanding is completely different to that. They don't think of God as being far off and not really concerned with the affairs of the world, setting it up like a clock and letting it run. No, their idea is very, very different. The ancient Israelite understanding, the biblical understanding, is that God is in charge and in control. God is intimately involved in the workings of the world. And God cares and provides for creation and for people. Now, that understanding of God's involvement in creation, I think, and I hope we'd agree, that we really need that understanding now in present circumstances. When we turn on the TV and we see mostly bad news, or we see, especially now, COVID-19 spreading and infecting more people, this pandemic advancing, and really, to be honest, it's all we're talking about right now, isn't it? And many of us, if you're living in Melbourne, or maybe other parts of the world are the same, in Melbourne here, we're entering another state of lockdown where different restrictions are, more intense restrictions are being put on us once again. You may be in another part of the world that is experiencing the same thing. When we see all of that turmoil, all of that trouble, we really need to, I think, reflect on the seventh day and what it means that God is resting, or that God rests. We need to reflect on that idea that God is on the throne, that God is in control, and reflect on God's care and God's concern and God's provision for the world. Yes, there's trouble. We want to acknowledge that. We don't want to deny that and pretend it's not there. We can't pretend it's not there. It's all around us. There is trouble in the world. There are difficult things that we are facing. But we do also want to recognize that actually trouble and difficulty comes and it goes. Difficulties pass. Turmoil passes. Things don't last forever. And yet God remains. We can take perhaps this lesson from ancient Israel. They, in light of this idea of God resting, they kept the seventh day of the week, the day when God rested, as a Sabbath day. They rested from all their work. They rested from working to provide for themselves. This rest day, this Sabbath day, wasn't about some acknowledgement of God letting the wheel spin and taking his hands off the wheel. No, this was about people taking their hands off the controls, about acknowledging God's position on the throne of the cosmos and recognizing God's ongoing provision for their lives. recognizing that their lives actually depended on God more than they depended on their own efforts and their own work. And that was what taking that Sabbath day was actually about. And we can adopt the same mindset. We usually don't take a specific Sabbath day in our culture, although we do have the weekends usually free. We have a different mindset about it. However, we can adopt something similar, a similar mindset to the one that they had in that time, in that we can recognize God's intimate involvement in the world, in our communities, in our lives. We can recognize His care, His control, His provision, and we can accept that. We can recognize God's sovereignty. And most importantly, when we recognize those things and accept them and understand them, we can let go of the need to control our own lives. We can let go of the need to have everything under control and everything known and everything understood. We can let go of that. And when we let go of that, we can actually rest. We can rest in this notion, in this idea of God resting, of God on the throne, of God in control, of God concerned and caring for us. And that's how I think we can take this passage that we've talked about this morning to heart. Now, to help us out with that a little bit, I've actually asked my friend Dee to assist us with a bit of a meditation that she's going to record and post for us. A meditation on this idea of God's sovereignty, a meditation on God being in control. And I hope that you'll join me in watching that video that she's put together and participate in that meditation. And look, I hope that in studying this passage this morning and talking about it a little bit, that through the Spirit and through God, things have jumped out at you that perhaps you didn't notice before, or some things that you'd like to explore a bit more. That would be awesome. I hope that you've been blessed by it, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. And lastly, again, I hope that you will join me to participate in this meditation that my friend Dee is putting together for us. Beyond that, I would say, look after yourselves, take care of yourselves, and take care, please, of each other.